2014. Here we are with a motion about the autocracy democracy in Egypt, and without any further ado, I'd like to invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate. The stage is yours.
Egypt has recently emerged from a bitter revolt during the Arab Springs uprising in 2011 due to its citizens wanting to fight for social justice and to oust its then current leader, Hosni Mubarak, from power because he was not meeting their needs and he broke all the promises that he made to them. And it was not only just due to the want for democracy, but because they all had their own different agendas. However, during the Arab Springs uprising, it led to countless of deaths and a crippled economy for Egypt. And also there's in Egypt this widespread sectarian violence between the majority Muslims, which become 90% of the country, and the minority of the Christians, and it's right throughout society, causing a great deal of damage and loss of life. Egypt also has terrorist organizations like Hamas and Al-Qaeda that spreading extremist rhetoric within society, orchestrating various attacks in the country, and also have worsening relations with their neighbor Israel due to territorial disputes and border skirmishes. Egypt has now reached a crossroads as to which method of governance to choose from. It can either choose a stable autocracy, which refers to a system of governance where the executive and legislative powers are concentrated in the hands of a single individual without any legal restraints that might curb their influence. A stable autocracy is one where the leader has already cemented his rule and has no need for extreme measures to concretize this rule. This will be similar to other countries around the world, such as the People's Republic of China, South Korea and Taiwan during the 1960s, and Vietnam. Or Egypt can choose a democracy, where a fully fledged democracy refers to a system of rule where by the people they use elections to select popular leaders to assume legislative and or executive powers. And a full-fledged democracy requires institutions for transparency as well as enforcement of these democratic processes. However, Egypt's democracy will be a weak one, which lacks the above-mentioned frameworks for that strong democracy has, making it vulnerable to coups and violence. And imposing a democracy on Egypt will cause Egypt to become a failed state like Afghanistan, Somalia, and Iraq. So both sides for today, they must prove which is best for the country in terms of guaranteeing short-term security and political stability, as well as fostering long-term socio-economic development and securing the best interests for the individuals. We'd like to clarify opposition cannot only argue about an ideal democracy or that all autocracies are bad. You must instead argue about the specific nuance of stable autocracies versus weak democracies, nuancing the context to Egypt alone. Our stance is that Egypt is a strong autocracy to ensure that it's stable and it's developed, and also the politicized populace to help it to transition to strong democracy. For example, South Korea and Taiwan, they were once stable autocracies and managed to transition to strong democracies successfully. And we'll show you in our 5 substantive arguments. The first being about preserving the rule of law, second about the economic benefits from a stable autocracy, the third about preventing extremist influence, and the fourth and fifth by my second speaker about preventing sectarian violence and also the impacts on foreign relations. So I'm now transitioning on to my first substantive argument about preserving the rule of law, where the thesis is that Egypt as a country lacks the established democratic structures and traditions of a democracy to allow for our citizens to vote for a strong government and leading to fragmentation of society. Egypt has a limited tradition of democracy, which causes people to misunderstand and misconstrue democratic mechanisms, as locals will assume that all campaign promises are absolute, hence succumbing to popular sentiment. When these parties are not voted to power, the civilians, they will assume the new government will not provide for them to the extent of their preferred leader would, and begin to riot and they begin to protest, believing that democracy means that the voices must be heard and the preferred leader must be in power, despite this group being the minority, and they believe that the government must be subservient to the populace. This further exacerbated in weak democracies with a lack of entrenched power base, and they are unable to exercise command over the local law enforcement, which will act on their own regard and weakening the rule of law. And because they are unable to control these desperate groups, they create a situation of continuous conflict when might is right. So, on comparative, in strong states, the government exerts full control of the executive force and able to protect civilians and stabilize the state in the process. This is evidence in Egypt under the Muslim Brotherhood, which has its own personal armed force and which aimed to destabilize the weak democratic Mansur government, massacring thousands of people after the removal of his leader and ex-president President Morsi, which shows how weak democracies lack the monopoly of power which strong states have and compromises on state stability. This brings me to my second substantive argument about the economic benefits of stable autocracies, where the thesis of my statement is that stable autocracies are better than weak democracies, as it ensures that economic policies that are targeted to revitalizing Egypt's economy. In weak democracy, there's a lack of entrenched power base where potential leaders begin to propagate identity-based policies that either cater to religious sentiment or aim to garner support. And this leads to policies which only benefit the leader's support base being implemented to maintain support. These policies fail to account for the country's economic needs due to its narrow scope and lack of understanding of the country's crucial industries that are integral in revitalizing the economy. As under this weak democracy, the people will assume that the government's policies are beneficial for the country, and that in fact they are actually detrimental, as the economic policies are not targeted towards promoting growth, but instead of pleasing the people, resulting in economic mismanagement and stagnation. This is, for example, led to the bread revolution in Egypt due to the bad economic policies in the country. Leaders of strong states, on the other hand, they come to power after severe economic crisis, when their large support base shows that they come with the ability to solve their economic problems, and thus their policies are best for the economy of the country. Strong states also do not need to pander to the populist views of the country, as they don't need to worry about being re-elected office, and are hence able to implement long-term policies. And because of this, they are able to focus on targeting vital sectors of the economy, allowing the economy to prosper and to grow. This is crucial for Egypt, whose economy was devastated after the Arab Spring's uprising and urgently needs economic growth to solve its internal problems. For example, in order to pander to the Muslim majority in society, President Morsi attempted to impose highly conservative policies within Egypt, such as bans on alcohol, as well as imposing an Islamic dress code in society. And not realizing the alienate tourists in Egypt, as because tourism makes up a major sector of the economy, 1/5 of the economy. Tourism industries declined by 30% as a result, because of these harsh new policies that are implemented, which shows how a weak democracy will never be able to create policies that enable Egypt's economy to recover and grow. This brings me nicely to my final substantive argument about preventing extremist influence within society, where the thesis of my argument is that stable autocracy is better than a weak democracy, as it prevents extremist influence that fragments Egypt. In order to maintain order in society, the weak democracies will ban extremist groups from running in the election to prevent the spread of extremist rhetoric that comes from these extremist groups. So what this means is that the government is willing to err on the side of caution by eliminating every single group that they deem to be extremist within society. And what this results in is this extremist political groups will feel that the government is unfairly suppressing. You're out of order, sir. But they feel that they're unfairly suppressing all of these all these extremist groups. And the impact of this is that because they feel suppressed, that they will start to begin to become radical because of the reason for it, because they want to gain traction in society, and feel that this will be the only way for the government and the people to listen to their ideas and their policies. And because of that, this radicalization is harmful, as it leads, although it leads to the society and the religious conservatives, actually leads to society being radicalized and extremist, which is eventually harmful for society. Strong states, on the other hand, are actually better because they do not allow for any single political party to run. So what this means is that there will not be a single group that is singled out from running, and there will be no religious groups that will turn extremist because there's no incentive to do so. For example, the Wahhabi sect in Egypt was barred from the elections due to their radical nature, and so what this meant was it resulted in the bomb attacks to garner attention, thus leading to political instability. Therefore, because outside ensures political stability and saves lives, I'm very proud to stand on side proposition.
Thank you, first speaker of the proposition for this my speech, and now I would like to invite the first speaker of the opposition to open the debate for the side.
In the last 3 years, Egypt has been in turmoil, with thousands dying to allow their voices to be heard. Prop's policy is only going to lead to more bloodshed, and I'm going to be proving this to you throughout my speech. Now, first let's just look at some context. We see that Egypt was an autocracy until there was a revolution against the regime, and people had issues with 4 things. 1, land distribution, 2, military involvement, but most importantly was civil liberties and representation. And what we see is this led to turmoil and civil unrest, which was used as a change system to achieve these civil liberties and representation, as this is what the people of the country felt was best for them. So, which is why we as opposition today feel that the debate hinges on which governance system is going to be best for Egypt as a country, as a whole, and for its people. So our burden of proof today is the following: to prove that weak democracies can give better representation and better civil liberties to the people of Egypt better than the stable autocracy will. Now, on to my case.
Point of information.
No, thank you. I will be speaking about the points of nature of autocratic governance, as well as the effect on the opposition, both in relation to stable autocracy, and my second speaker will be speaking on the benefits of democracy. But first, let's just take a look at a bit of the Bible. So from the Prop's first speaker, we had points on preserving rule of law, and our eventual conclusion to this was that in a democracy we're going to have less rioting as well as more stability. And I find that this very much relates to point of information. This relates very much to the point on preventing extremist influence. And let me rebut that, and I feel the rebuttal will contextualize this. Now, what proposition came up and said was we would ban extremist groups to make it safer for people, and also then we don't get religious groups who might believe that being violent is part of the religion, so therefore we make it fairer and safer. Nothing. But what we actually see is, we feel it's actually a minority group of people who are going to be like this. And moreover, what we also see is that democracies can effectively ban these. You see, they will be able to effectively ban these groups. The two are not mutually exclusive. But moreover, what we see is, and this is the beauty of democracy, what democracy allows us to do is it allows us to celebrate these views and allow them to have this representation. And moreover, what we feel is very important is that because of the original reason for these rights, which was representation, we feel it will only be detrimental to the society to take a section of people who want to be represented and cut them off. We feel that this is wrong, and we don't feel that this will actually be best for the country, and we also feel it will be leading from the right. So I'm now going to be moving on to my substantive matter with my first point on the nature of autocratic governments. And with this I'm going to prove to you the following. I'm going to be proving that stable autocracies undermine people's civil liberties and don't give them representation, and that this is going to lead to civil unrest in the country. Now, stable autocracies have one ruler who has not been voted in, and he has got his own agenda, which means this person has the ability to execute policies to suit this agenda. Now, this causes two things. One, we get a new incentive structure for the leader, which I'm going to be speaking about later in my second point. But secondly, we get a clear lack of representation. Let's take a look at why this is. As I showed in my context, people want to have their views represented in policy making. But because policies are now made to suit this leader's personal agenda, this necessarily cannot happen. In a system that relies on the centralization, of power and control, to do this would limit and undermine the government's control. And so what we therefore see is we cannot have representation in the system if the government wants to remain in control. Now let's take a look at what this causes. Because of this lack of representation in policy making and other things, policies will focus on the wishes of the leader and not of that of the people. And therefore, policies put forward from dissenting voices aimed at giving the people in a moment. Policies aimed from these dissenting voices aimed at giving the people of Egypt civil liberties and representation, they won't do this. They will in fact actually undermine these liberties and quality of life. Yes?
By your logic, your side supports regimes like Muhammad Gaddafi, which killed thousands of people in an attempt to assert his power.
Well, ma'am, as you said in your own matter, we see that this person is coming from this power struggle and coming from the struggle. So moreover, what we see is if he's experienced this kind of oppression, we will likely see that he is going to be more unlikely to be doing those kinds of acts because he's come from a regime that did it before him. So we likely see that morally speaking, he will likely not do it. But moreover, we don't support the needless killing of people. What we support is giving the majority of people and giving everyone stability, is giving them what they are asking for, and that is the representation of their views and their civil liberties. Now back onto my point. This leads nicely into my point. We see is we are actually undermining these civil liberties and people's quality of life because the leader is focused on his personal agenda and not the people's wishes. And this means citizens are not represented, and this is what Egypt has been going for. So what we therefore see is because the leader focuses on himself and not the people, he won't focus on their quality of life and only his own. And therefore we see quality of life for the people therefore decrease, leading to unhappy people, which leads to more civil disorder, which is bad for the country as a whole. And what we see is this is a reoccurrence of the past. So now with this point, I've now proven three things. One, stable autocracies cannot represent people's views. Two, this will lead to people's civil rights being undermined. And three, just as in the past, this will lead to more civil unrest and to national countries. Now on to my second point of the effect on the opposition. What this I'm going to prove to you. Autocracies are incentivized to suppress dissenting voices, and two, due to the nature of the power vacuum in Egypt, things like the media, political rights, and civil liberties will be suppressed. And this will all lead to more civil unrest and tension, which is bad for the country. Let's take a look at this in my first layer. Now what we see is within society, different voices and opinions around governments and political ideologies exist due to different values held. And we see this very much in Egypt's previous revolutions. But because autocratic leaders want to remain in power as long as possible, they're incentivized to suppress any voices that challenge them. So they can maintain two things, power and control, which already exist due to the fact that there is stability. And this, we see this is likely to be exacerbated. So what we therefore see is there is an incentive, there's an incentive to suppress dissenting voices to maintain power. Now let's take a look at layer two. First we need a crucial piece of context. Well, we see the situation in Egypt. Power vacuum exists due to these previous revolutions, with various individuals wanting to claim power. These individuals pander to citizens to be seen as legitimate by polarizing certain issues and ideologies. What does this mean? Due to different ideologies, the person who gets power is likely to place laws to safeguard this position. And he does this by suppressing other voices. For example, media, political rights, and civil liberties. And what we see is what this actually leads to is people are being unhappy and being suppressed, as we have seen in the past, which leads to increased tension, as we have seen in the past. And thirdly, this leads to civil unrest, which we see is bad for the country as a whole, which proposition themselves are weak. What we see is civil unrest leads to instability, which leads to revolution, which leads to yet more instability, which have in themselves said they are trying to avoid. What we therefore see is, ladies and gentlemen, it is necessary for us, for this motion to fall. These are all the things I've proved.
I thank the first speaker of the opposition. Now I'd like to invite the second speaker of the proposition to continue the debate with the proposition. Tim, the stage is yours.
In today's debate, we see an opposition side whose case is hung on two key flaws. Firstly, they sought to impose their own yardstick of, quote, civil liberties and representation for the people, because that was somehow what Egypt wanted. But this completely ignored the characterization that my first speaker already told you, and they haven't concretely taken it down. That the Arab Spring did not just stem from these civil liberties, or the want for these civil liberties, but rather the dissent of the people from a wide variety of sources. They haven't countered that, and because of that, they haven't yet proven that their side best meets the needs of the people. Even then, as an opposition side in today's debate, they are obliged to engage the yardstick that we as a proposition side have set up for them, and they have so far failed in doing so. But rather, their second key flaw in their case is that they never talked about weak democracies. All of the benefits that they talked about were contingent on a strong democratic system already existing. One that had a separation of the branches of government, one that had checks and balances to ensure that this democratic mechanisms would not be abused. However, in Egypt, we see a lack of democratic tradition, we see a lack of all of these structures, and thus all of the benefits that they talked about may have come true under a strong democracy, but not a weak one. Their side still has to prove that a weak democracy will necessarily achieve all of these aims. And because of these two key flaws in their case, I have two main points of contention today. Firstly, on the entire idea of civil liberties, which span the majority of their first speaker's speech, and secondly, on their responses to my first speaker. On to the first point of contention, on the idea of civil liberties. And here's where opposition argued that autocratic leaders necessarily led to the pursuit of personal agendas and thus was to the detriment of the quality of life for the people on the ground. But on the first layer of analysis, autocrats have no incentive to clamp down on the people in this manner, because we need to recognize what kind of world we're living in right now. It's a post-Arab Spring paradigm, where autocratic leaders in the past have already used all of these punitive measures to crack down on the rights of the people, to severely curtail their rights. And what was the result of that? The Arab Spring uprisings, where they see the people rising up and removing them from power. Thus, in the wake of the Arab Spring, autocracies now have greater incentive to shy away from these strong strategies and take a more even-handed approach in governing their countries. And so all of the abuses that opposition talk about would never come to place. Here's where we give you the example of the Republic of Vietnam, the socialist state, which has been ruled by the Communist Party since the 1960s and 70s, but has yet to impose severe penalties on its people because it knows that it needs the popular support of the people to continue existing. Now, here we had an opposition that presented a far worse paradigm, where the weak democracies have an even greater incentive to abuse their power, because by their nature they are inherently weak. They are open to all sorts of challenges to their authority, and thus they're even more able to use these punitive measures to clamp down on their citizens, to ensure that dissent doesn't take place, to ensure that these weak democratic institutions can remain in power. We give you the example of post-independence Indonesia in 1945, where the weak democracy in place led to widespread violence and civil war. This is the paradigm that opposition presents, and this is something that we completely reject. And this is an idea that I'll be forwarding further in my own substantive on how weak democracies abuse their power and are worse for foreign relations. But suffice to say, the quality of life is far better under a stable autocracy where governments have an obligation to serve the needs of the people. This brings me to my second point of contention on the responses to my first.
Sir.
And here, I'll take you in a moment, sir. Your opposition conflated two very distinct substantives. Before that, go ahead.
So, we already proved to you that instead of listening to people, these leaders could just suppress their views. Can you please explain to us why they necessarily are not incentivized to do this before that point instead?
So as we've already demonstrated in my earlier rebuttal, these autocratic leaders have learned from the lessons of past regimes, where past regimes have tried to clamp down on people and failed, and thus newer regimes that come along that are these stable autocracies that we on opposition are advocating will not be incentivized to do so. But moving back to my point of contention, they conflated the two very distinct ideas on firstly the rule of law and secondly extremism. On the first idea of rule of law, they never tackled the key logic that my first speaker brought to you on how weak democracies were unable to control law enforcement mechanisms. And this was far worse under weak democracies where no rule of law could be established. But even then, on the second point of extremism, their solution was that democracy could simply, quote, ban them. And this is exactly the harm that my first speaker elucidated. Because in the final analysis, they never took down our key arguments, and they indeed entirely dropped the idea of economic harm. This is significant because they concede that the tourism industry will be paralyzed, that these governments won't be able to make the correct decisions for the interests of their people. Now, that's their material dealt with. I'm now transitioning to my own constructive argument, firstly on preventing sectarian violence. The thesis of this argument is that a strong state provides a stable platform for governments to function without the influence of sectarian conflict, and this makes them far better than weak democracies. Because a hallmark of weak democracies is the presence of various elements within society trying to gain power in the first place, and this leads to enormous amounts of infighting between parties and within parties. This is inherent within a democracy because they need to garner votes and raise a public profile, and even worse in weak democracies, where democracy is considered to be a zero-sum game. You either win or you either lose. It's us versus them. And it is precisely because of these harmful paradigms that it's worse in a weak democracy. In Egypt, we need to consider how there are secularist and religious fundamentalist organizations that are seeking to gain power and shape the country in their own image. And the result of all of this happening under a weak democracy is fierce contention between parties over the balance of power, allowing for disputes over the religious nature of the state to take place, and in the end leading to more sectarian violence between the majority Muslims and the minority Christians. Conversely, a strong state is free of these sectarian attachments and concentrates power on an individual or a group of individuals. So there's less room for arguments to take place and less room for sectarian violence. Here's where we give you the example of the Ivory Coast, where the allegedly fraudulent election of their president Gbagbo sparked violence between pro-government Christians and opposition Muslims. We don't want that to happen. We want a unified Egypt where all ethnicities and religions can coexist, and this is made possible under an autocracy. This brings me to my final argument on improving foreign relations. No, thank you. The thesis of this final argument is that a weak democracy chooses to incite tensions with neighboring states in order to preserve its own unsteady hold on power, something that a stable autocracy does not do and is hence superior. Here's where we clash entirely with their idea of how weak democracies are less likely to abuse their power. Now, this abuse of power occurs because the government's hold on power is very weak, often continuously challenged by other parties or entities. The government is incentivized to seek a common unifying factor, to divert attention away from domestic troubles, to galvanize public sentiment against a common enemy, to assert a degree of authority and responsibility that it currently lacks. The end result is that it chooses to show aggression towards neighboring states, to show that the country is strong, and this is achieved by way of threatening rhetoric. And these attempts to prop up their own power creates tension and hostility with neighboring states. This is especially so for Egypt, which lies at the heart of the Middle Eastern arc of crisis and borders Israel, which is a source of regional enmity. Conversely, a strong state lacks this incentive to abuse their power because they already have a strong hold on power over their citizens, and thus they are less likely to engage other nations in such an adversarial manner. We give you the example of Egypt itself, where Mohamed Morsi attempted to concretize his weak mandate for the presidency by hurling threats of hostility against Israel, in the hopes that it might boost support for his regime. And likewise in Argentina, where President Galtieri attempted to drive support for his weak democracy by invading the Falkland Islands in 1982. We don't want regional destabilization, and we don't want what opposition stands for. What we want is an Egypt that is strong and is able to progress in the future, and because of that, I am proud to stand in proposition.
Thank you, second speaker, for this my speech. Now inviting the second speaker of the opposition to continue with the debate. Stage is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, our objective today is to prove to you that a weak democracy is better than a stable democracy when it comes to achieving civil liberties and representation. Let's relook at our burden proof. Our burden proof is to prove to you that a stable autocracy cannot achieve two things: civil liberties and representation. As I stated before, we're talking about benefits of democracy. But before I go into this, I would like to go into some of the speaker came up here and said everything that my first speaker said only happens in strong democracies. As we can see with what my first speaker said, we clearly stated that this happens within all democracies, strong and weak. The second thing I said, they said autocratic leaders won't impose restrictions on people. We see this as actual. As within an autocratic leader, a lot of the times, as we did, they're looking at their own agenda. They are looking to keep themselves in power. Therefore, they would oppose restrictions on the people, so as an autocratic leader does something wrong, the people may not take him out. They also came up here and said that they won't do this because they learned from the lessons of the past. We don't exactly see this as
Point of information.
We see the past autocratic leader, Hosni Mubarak, didn't give insufficient laws as to not be taken out. Whereas we see the New York would learn from the mistakes of Hosni Mubarak and restrict people from actually taking out. They also came out here and said democracy is a 0 to 1 game. You either win or lose. We don't exactly see this when it comes to the population. As you see within all democracies, most of the time, actually all of the time, are looking at the people winning. That's where democracy is. They also said that a weak democracy hurts international relations and neighborly relations. We don't see this. As we see that most of the world, it promotes democracy. Promotes democracy, whether it may be strong or weak. As we see, I'm now finished with my rebuttal, so I'd like to go on to our first one, representation. We also see that in a democracy, representation. We see that the reason for the disorder within Egypt is they seem to be like they were not represented properly within the government. We see this by Egypt having two revolutions of autocratic leaders that didn't represent the system of the country in the best way possible. We see that with having proper representation within government, people of the country are trustworthy within the government, and therefore allowing the government to work to the best of their abilities. The citizens ultimately trust that they have a say in choosing who governs them. We see this as being an advantage in a country such as Egypt that needs for its people to have faith in the government. Even if the party you voted for does not ultimately go to power, you still know that the government that guides is what your fellow citizens voted for. And that will ultimately give you a sense of trust within the government. And trust within your will to be able to hold said government accountable for any wrongdoing in future elections. We see this as being a problem within a traditional autocracy, as there will be laws set in place so as the people of the country are not able to speak out against the government without consequences, or to press opposition to keep power and control. So by giving the people a voice within a democracy, we are ultimately looking out for what is best for the people of said country, and more specifically Egypt. We see that when the citizens of a country have faith in their government, the voice is heard, and their voice are heard, they're ultimately happier. And no, thank you. And there is less tension within the country as desired. This is extremely beneficial in Egypt. In an international community that is in an international community. We see this country has seen a lot of anger in its past years, and ultimately a lack of major growth within the country. We have seen a lot of money being lost over the current revolt in Egypt, where the people weren't happy, and ultimately this affected the growth of the country. The second thing I would like to go to is civil liberties. We also see that within a democracy, a country's minority is better represented. As democracies ultimately are ultimately looking at helping all citizens. We see that in autocracy, the leader is focused on the majority, as they are the one who will ultimately revolt and take him more out of power. Whereas in a democracy, these minorities are given certain rights, so as to be able to be equal with the majority of the population, allowing for policies that affect affect marginalized people's quality of life. We see that by giving these people the rights they ultimately deserve, this will show the general population that the government cares about all. So as we see within a democracy, the citizen's right and quality of life is better fulfilled, therefore leading to less tension within the country. The next thing I would like to go to is active citizenry. Democracy can offer modification in government without hostility. In a democracy, authority can be resigned from one party to another by mode of elections. The power of the general public of a country decides its ruling power. Furthermore, any government is confined to an election tenure, after which it is to contend against other parties to recover power. This method averts a monopoly of the reigning party. The reigning authorities have to ensure it functions effectively for its people, as it cannot continue being the authority subsequent to carrying out term unless re-elected by the people. We see that in a country such as Egypt, this will be an advantage, as the people of the country are able to decide their own fate through means of election. No, thank you. This inculcates a feeling of responsibility towards the citizens. The reigning party owes their accomplishment in the election to the people of power. This leads to a feeling of thankfulness towards the citizens. It can act as inspiration to function for the people. For it is the citizens that have ultimately authority over selecting their governments. An additional vital advantage of democracy is that the citizens achieve a sense of contribution, of selecting their government. They get the chance to speak out about their views by method of electoral voting. And furthermore, invest and involve themselves in politics of the country because of trust in said government. Ladies and gentlemen, we see that a democracy achieves, that a weak democracy would achieve three things for the Egyptian people: more representation, civil liberties, and active citizenry, culminating in less tension in Egypt. Therefore, after we see everything, a weak democracy is better for Egypt and its people in the long run. Thank you.
I thank the second speaker of the opposition for his fine speech, and now I'm inviting the third speaker of the proposition to continue the debate. The stage is yours.
as well as in legislation. Unfortunately, that doesn't really occur in Egypt, which is why they cannot fully talk about democracy as a concept, but have to nuance it specifically to Egypt, something they haven't done, and therefore they don't fulfill that side of the motion. So therefore, but more than that, they also try to impose an arbitrary yardstick on their side that they only had to talk about civil liberties. But that's not true. Right from my first speaker, we already told you why we need to talk about guaranteeing short-term security as well as political stability, fostering long-term social economic development, as well as the best interests of individuals. And they only wanted to talk about civil liberties. On both sides, I'm going to be taking down these arguments and showing you why our side truly does what's best in both circumstances. Now let's deal with this debate in two main points of contention. Firstly, what's best for the Egyptian people, and secondly, what's best for the country. On the first point, what's best for the people? Under this was our first substantive on preserving the rule of law, and this was a substantive completely dropped by opposition, when they never responded to it and simply conflated it with other substantives. But let's give you additional reasons for why it's even worse to preserve the rule of law under a weak democracy. Because under a weak democracy, the individuals who are in power are the cronies of the particular dictator, which means that the individuals who vote in power are still individuals who come from the same thread from the particular dictator, and that is worse to preserve the rule of law, because these individuals essentially still carry out the same function, except the difference is that, and here's where we clinch that argument, because they function under a veneer of legitimacy, that these individuals have been able to gather the legitimacy from the people and claim that they work for the people, even though it necessarily isn't so. For example, when Morsi came into power, he tried to give himself unlimited powers in order to clamp down about the Mubarak era, but that simply wasn't true, and he essentially gave himself unlimited powers to pass any particular policy without support from the people. This was worse because he functioned under veneer of legitimacy, and it was essentially like a autocracy. Yes, sir?
Now, your second speaker already said that because of the nature of Egypt, they are unlikely to place laws in place like this. So therefore we see that analysis in and of itself doesn't work, because they're going to put these laws in place.
You have to understand what the idea of the Arab Springs is. The Arab Springs is that now these individuals within strong states have to hold the line and have a balance between caring for the people as well as long-term development. An idea brought to you by my first speaker, and idea never once tackled on your side. Therefore, whilst individuals who these dictators remain in power, they are cognizant and aware of the fact that they still have to care for the people and strike that balance between doing what's best for the country and doing what's best for the people. Comparatively, on opposition, it simply results in a situation where the minute the people are unhappy with the government, they will riot, they will take it to the streets because they don't understand, because they haven't been exposed to the idea of democracy at all, and therefore it's far worse on your side. Next to the idea of the lack of representation, my first speaker already told you why there's no incentive, for example, like the Arab Spring. And even if the idea of representation is even worse, because like I just told you, it gives them the idea of a veneer of legitimacy like Morsi, which is comparatively far worse on their side, which is why we better achieve representation for the people, even if it's the idea of civil liberties, because we don't allow these dictators to function with legitimacy, to give them free rein when they operate under this particular idea of having the legitimacy of the people. Now let's move on to the next idea, where they try to tell us about the faith in government, which was their second speaker's first substantive, because at least their voices are concerned. It's actually even worse than opposition, because what you do is that you negate the idea of a vote, because when people vote, they don't see their vote translating into any particular change, and this is worse, because when people voice out, it doesn't actually translate to any particular change at all. What happens is that people further become disillusioned with democracy, because they see that their vote doesn't work, they see that their vote doesn't translate to any particular change, and this further drives people away from the idea of democracy on opposition. That's why it's far worse. Next on their second substantive on the idea of citizenship, here was where they simply talked about a mature democracy where the government worked for the people. That's really not true, because it's even worse on opposition. Let's listen to the kind of logic they try to tell us, that these individuals are power hungry. These individuals want to entrench their power. Therefore, going by their very own logic, why would these dictators have any incentive to further please the people in any particular way? Instead, what they're going to do on it, even if we assume and take that characterization, is that they're simply going to clamp down on the people even more, because they know that their powers are being threatened. Compare for the country. Firstly, the idea of foreign relations, again, was an idea completely dropped. They never responded to the idea of foreign relations and how under weak democracies it's even worse because they want to divert attention away from their particular country. Therefore, they concede that foreign relations will be even worse. Now let's move on to our third substantive, on the idea of extremism. The only response we heard to this is that it's a minority of groups and therefore it won't come about. But even then, within places like Egypt, places like the Wahhabi sect, even though they are considered a minority group, these are your individuals who make an extremely large difference because they have a loud halo effect. These individuals stand up and they scream that the government is trying to clamp down on these particular individuals. Therefore, even if it was a minority of groups, the impact is still far greater in society, something we cannot allow when they start to resort to things like extremism and violent means. Now let's move on to the next idea, where they try to tell us about the second speaker's substantive on the suppression of opposition. Firstly, my second speaker already told you why they don't have the incentive to do so. Additionally, we're going to tell you that these individuals further don't have the incentive because of the idea of international scrutiny. When the international community at large heavily scrutinizes and condemns nations which carry out such atrocities. For example, in China, where they have been forced to close many of their labor camps because of the fact that the international community at large has been criticizing them, giving them sanctions, which is why these autocracies, acknowledging that they need to function and work with the rest of the international community to get resources, to get the kinds of trade that they need, they further won't have this incentive to continue abusing their particular power within society. And now let's move on to the last idea of economic benefits. Again, this was an idea completely dropped on the side of opposition. They never responded to how within weak democracies, economic policies become us versus UK. It becomes identity-based politics where individuals when these particular rulers within weak democracies cannot account for the economy as a whole. Therefore, they concede on that point. We also take that point on how to further make the economy even worse. Therefore, because we truly do what's best for people, we truly do what's best for the country, at the end of the day, I am very proud to stand on the side of proposition.
Thank you, first speaker of the proposition, and I'm inviting the last instructed speaker to continue the debate with the opposition.
So in today's debate, we're dealing with Egypt. Egypt has seen revolution. Egypt has seen violence. This violence has occurred because of two things mainly. People have not had their civil liberties given to them, and their views within society have not been represented by the government. We see that the governments who are ousted as stable autocracies were not effective in doing these things. So the issue of contention today, mainly, is that we have to prove to you that a weak democracy will better account for the people's civil liberties and their right to representation of views as opposed to a stable autocracy. And in relation to this, I have identified several clashes. Firstly, I will deal with agenda. Secondly, with representation of views. Thirdly, the efficiency of a democracy, and this relates to the fact that it's a weak democracy. And fourthly, faith in government, foreign relations, and then economic benefits and some miscellaneous points. Firstly, on agenda. So, proposition today has said that the agenda of weak democracies is to get re-elected, and thus they will, based upon this short-term incentive, they will not enact any meaningful change in the country, and that they will suppress the people. Now we find this especially problematic in that this no thank you. In that a stable autocracy, by definition, a stable autocracy is a single ruler who has all the power. Now we see that this centralized power means that this leader wishes to stay in power, and that he has, of course, all the power in the government, and therefore we believe this is problematic because it will necessarily, no thank you, lead to this leader oppressing people to the point where he cannot be opposed or deposed. We believe that in a stable autocracy, there is absolutely no incentive for the leader to deal with and this relates to representation abuse, with the needs of the people, because they have all the power and they can implement any form of regulation that can oppress and suppress the people. No, thank you. Until the point where the people have absolutely no freedom, cannot express themselves in any meaningful manner. Okay, so moving on to the representation abuse within these two governance systems. So they have a proposition today has said that a stable autocracy will result in representation abuse because they are incentivized to represent the people in the long term due to the fear of deposition. No, thank you. And they have said that a weak democracy, due to the short-term incentive, will do nothing. And this we find very problematic in that we believe that a stable autocracy will not represent the people's views because they value only their own power and will further only themselves. No, thank you. And in a weak democracy, due to the short-term incentive, as these governments want to be re-elected, they will, for this reason, they will deal with the issues in the country, and because of this, they will attempt to enact change in the country and thus garner votes to get to the next election. Whereas in a stable autocracy, it is seen that these leaders have absolutely no incentive. They hold all the power, no thank you. And they have absolutely no need to pander to the views of the people because they can simply oppress and suppress them, as we have said. So, fourthly, faith in government. So today's proposition has said that a weak democracy cannot result in a faith.
Why definition?
No, thank you. Because it cannot result in a faith in government because a weak democracy will not represent the views of the people, and they will simply be an inefficient system that does nothing for the people. And we say that it is for the reason that a weak democracy is implemented by elections, which means that people play a part in electing these governments, and therefore they will for that reason have faith in the government. And furthermore, people must have faith in the government because there are structures in place in a weak democracy that ensure that their views are heard. No, thank you. And that in a stable autocracy, no faith is seen in the government because they are an oppressive system that seeks not to deal with the needs of the people, but only to grow their own wealth and their own power unto a point that the people have no ability to express themselves. And so, yes.
Your side further pushes people away from democracy because they are unable to solve the economic problems, which is why people were okay with Suharto, but not okay with Sukarno, even though Suharto was an autocracy.
Okay, so you're dealing with economic problems, and what you said in this regard is that a weak democracy, because it is weak, cannot implement efficient economic policy, and that this policy will be biased based upon the fact that they pander to a specific group of people. And we find this problematic because a stable autocracy will not seek to achieve economic benefits for the citizens, but only centralize power further and garner wealth to the elite. And that in a weak democracy, as I have said, these leaders are incentivized by the need to be re-elected, that they need to enact change in the country, and thus they will, based upon this fact, they must attempt to achieve these economic benefits for their citizens. Okay, so dealing with foreign relations. Now they have come up and said that in a weak democracy,
Point of information, sir.
no, thank you. In a weak democracy, leaders will incite regional conflict so as to divert attention from the situation in their country. And we find this problematic because there is nothing to indicate that a stable autocracy will do the same thing if that stable autocracy is not efficient. And we find that a weak democracy in and of itself can be efficient and more efficient than a stable autocracy, in that we believe that even though a weak democracy can be flawed, and likely will be flawed by virtue of the fact that it is weak, we believe that a stable autocracy is more flawed in that this centralization of power ensures abuse of the citizens' rights and a decreased quality of life for the people. A weak democracy will, for the reasons of the agenda to stay in power and get re-elected, whereas in a stable autocracy there is absolutely no incentive because the leaders cannot be replaced and they remain in power perpetually. We believe that it is for the reason that weak democracies are incentivized to help the people due to the nature of their governance system, whereas a stable autocracy will not. And it is for these reasons, thank you, we will look into.
Okay, I thank the respected speaker. Now I'd like to invite the reply speakers to conclude this debate. First, I invite the reply speaker of the opposition. The stage is yours.
Throughout today's debate, what we see is a number of points of contention, and I'm going to be showing to you why it is why we as opposition will ultimately solve the issues present in Egypt, and I'm going to be proving to you through asking a number of questions. My first question is, what is going to give people what they want? What is going to be giving people which government system gives them representation and civil rights? And then my second question is, do we actually see any harms coming into play with this system? And if there are any harms, do the benefits outweigh them? So let's just take a look at this. And our answer to our first question is that weak democracy can still better represent the people's views as well as give them civil liberties than a stable autocracy can. And we gave this to you through a number of levels. Firstly, what we told you was that autocratic governance does four things. One, we don't get representation. Two, we don't get liberties. Three, we get a decreased quality of life due to the lack of incentive for the leader to listen to his people. And this all will lead to civil disorder, which would be a reoccurrence of the past, which proposition are trying and opposition are trying to avoid. Now, what this was then responded to was by saying that less strong methods will be used because this leader has come from these previous revolutions and he won't be following his own agenda. But what we see is the following, and this comes down to their very own context. They told us that the majority of people in the country were Muslims and the minority were Christians. That means, in all likelihood, the leader is likely going to be Muslim. Therefore, his agenda is based on Muslim principles, and therefore we see that Christian principles are not seen there. And this was brought up by their own context. So we see that as being an issue. But now let's just quickly ask, what is going? So we see that now that weak democracies are going to be giving civil liberties as well as representation. But now let's see, do we really see any harms here? No. And the proposition pointed out a number of harms and a number of things within our case, and that within a weak democracy, within an autocracy, that government has got full control and response, and we've got true responsibility. But we came and we told you that there is actually a very effective form of responsibility within democracy, and that also mitigates the harm of lack of representation, and that is the following. What that is, when that person's term is up and we don't like them and we want to hold them responsible, we have a number of systems in place which we told you. One, we can depose them, and two, just after 4 years, we can vote them out. So we actually see there are a number of ways to mitigate these harms you brought us, and we brought this up during our case. So ladies and gentlemen, what we've now shown you is the following. We've now shown you that a stable autocracy is going to that a stable autocracy is not going to best give the representation of people's views in policy making and in other general decisions for the country. But moreover, they actually undermine civil liberties and civil rights. And we don't feel this is okay because this is the original reason for the Arab Spring. So we therefore feel that our case has to stand. Moreover, we see that the harms that side proposition have pointed out are easily mitigated by systems already in place within democracy. And it's for all of these reasons that we therefore feel that today's motion must fall.
Thank you, Reply Speaker of the Opposition. Now I'd like to invite the Reply Speaker of the Proposition to conclude this debate. The stage is yours.
In today's debate, we had two sides casting the die on the future of Egypt. But on side opposition, they didn't debate the motion. They tried to evade the yardstick that my first speaker very clearly and very fairly established, that we wanted what was best for short-term security and long-term development of Egypt. None of their rebuttals touched that yardstick. None of their argumentation fulfilled that burden. Even then, they wanted to talk about their own yardstick, but fell woefully short of even meeting it. Their arguments never recognized the difference between a strong democracy, which was what all their argumentation was hung on, but rather a weak democracy, which they failed to talk about. A weak democracy that lacked any form of checks and balances, and thus would never achieve civil liberties or representation. They mischaracterized strong autocracies as necessarily evil and punitive, even as we showed you down the line how they had no incentive to, because they needed to stay in power, they needed to build up their own nation, and they were under immense international scrutiny. In the end, opposition completely dropped all of our arguments and were never able to directly clash on what we presented. And even they had a lack of response in their late rally, in their third speaker. This was tremendously insufficient. Let's analyze today's debate in two key areas of clash. Firstly, on the nature of a weak democracy, and secondly, on what was best for people on the ground. On to the first point of contention, on the nature of weak democracy. And already opposition failed to address the fundamental nature of weak democracies that my first speaker very clearly set out. That these are weak governments that are being constantly undermined, have no control over legal mechanisms, and fundamentally lack the institutions to function in the first place. Functions that they wanted to talk about but would never happen in Egypt. No independent judiciary, no separation of powers, and thus open to abuse. Opposition wanted to secure civil liberties for the people. Never mind that these weak democracies were far more likely to abuse their own power to entrench their already weak hold on power. And autocracies existing in a post-Arab Spring world simply did not have the incentive to perform in the same way. Opposition wanted to talk about representation for the people, but never recognized how weak democracies could never guarantee this because they lacked the mechanisms. Instead, all they wanted was what my third speaker very clearly illustrated to you, a disgruntled population that didn't see their vote translate into any concrete benefit and so resorted to violence on the streets. On the other side, proposition gave you a very clear idea of how stable autocracies were better for the people because we limited extremist influence and we prevented sectarian violence from taking place. All points that even their reply speaker conceded to when he started to talk about the rule of the majority. In the end, we didn't want a zero-sum game, and in the end, we heard no responses from opposition taking down these arguments. And therefore, we did what was best for civil liberties and representation. Opposition never fulfilled their own yardstick. On to the second point of contention, on what was best for the people. And this was the main thrust of proposition's case, per our own yardstick clearly stated in our first speaker. We wanted short-term stability and long-term stability, as well as security in all aspects. We brought to you the idea of economic policy, how governments needed to decide based on what was best for the country and not simply what was popular, which is what weak democracies would do. We talked about foreign relations and how weak democracies wanted to prop themselves up by lashing out at other nations, creating more tension and more conflict. All of these never concretely responded to by opposition. They never tackled the key logic that we gave to you. In the final analysis, opposition would create another Indonesia, another Venezuela, where people lost faith in democracies and their capability to fulfill the basic needs of the people, and so resorted to other means, disorder. All of that we wanted to avoid, because we definitively proved what was better for Egypt was a strong state that allowed Egypt to stand tall and proud once more.
I thank the last speaker, I thank all the debaters for this fine debate. Now you can shake hands and I'll ask you to